delighted that you could come. When I say we, I mean Curtis Wilkie, who is the senior fellow of the Overby Center and defines Southern journalism and politics. And he's going to join me in questioning our distinguished speaker, or semi-distinguished, depending on how strong a Republican you are. You know, Stuart, Curtis wrote the headline for the poster that said, "Dissident Republican, come see one." It didn't quite say that. Stuart Stevens, I think most of you know, or you probably wouldn't be here, is a widely circulated pundit, a Renaissance man. He's on TV, he tweets, and he writes columns and blogs about politics and things of interest to him. And things of interest to him are many. He travels. He really is a Renaissance man. Does a lot of things besides politics. He actually has a life beyond politics. And we might get into that as the evening goes along. But Stuart knows Ole Miss well. His father was recently honored here. How old's your father now?
98.
98. Phineas Stevens. And Stuart?
He is the oldest living member of the Student Hall of Fame, which is, he says, you get it by default at 98.
So that's quite an honor. And so we're just so glad you're here, Stuart, and you're willing to share your insights with us.
Great.
Stuart and Curtis have known each other a long time. They first met in Boston. And maybe one of you would like to tell the story of that encounter, whether it was adversarial or love at first sight, or what?
Well, semi-adversarial, because I'm a reporter and you have to have adversarial relationships with the people you cover. But I was covering the gubernatorial race in Massachusetts in 1990, and the Republican candidate, or actually he was still fighting for the nomination, if I recall. And on board his campaign became this young whiz-bang guy, Stuart Stevens, who I learned was from Mississippi. And so we actually struck up a conversation, and he gave me a couple of his travel books to read, which I like travel books. They're more fun than political books, and discovered he is a damn good writer. And so that was kind of the beginning of a friendship that's existed across party lines in journalism for more than 25 years.
Now Bill Wells, who's running with Gary Johnson, will be our next vice president.
Well, that's a pretty good segue into the presidential race. And this is a news operation here, and we might as well start with the lead. What's your take on the debate last night?
I'm sort of with, I think, what is the conventional wisdom. I thought it was a good night for Hillary Clinton, a not so good night for Donald Trump. Not a disastrous night. But I think that there were greater opportunities for Trump that were missed. And I think there was a greater need for him to define himself as someone that people could be comfortable with as being president, which makes sense. Never run for office before. He's never had a stage like that. When I worked on Governor Bush's campaign in 2000, we found it really wasn't until after that first debate with Gore that a majority of people could see him as president. And I don't think that helped Donald Trump last night.
You said it was not a great night for Trump. Stuart tweeted throughout the debate. He has a following, literally.
I have to stop that.
He literally has a following nationwide, and he started by saying, "I'm watching the debate from Ole Miss," and so everybody knew where he was. And Stuart, I wanted to talk more about how he helped other presidential candidates prepare for debates. But this is what Stuart tweeted early into the debate. I guess not too early, but midway in the debate, Trump brought 20 minutes of material to a 90-minute show. What did you mean by that?
Well, he just kind of had these riffs in his head that he kept going back to, which he sort of laid out at the beginning. And I think the beginning of the debate was the best part of the debate for him. But after that, he sort of didn't have any, it was like a comic who ran out of material. And I think that's not the first time that's happened. If you go back to 2004, the first presidential debate between then President Bush and Senator Kerry, the same thing really kind of happened to George Bush. You know, he just sort of, if you go back and look at it, you know, he ends up saying, well, you know, this is hard work a lot. And he didn't really have 90 minutes worth of sort of stuff that he wanted to talk about in that debate.
So he recovered.
Yeah, he recovered. He also had a different...
What did y'all do? What did you do to help him recover?
He, well, you know, for that debate, the decision had been made. It makes sense that the best thing you could do really for him is to, like a lot of debate, was sort of up his confidence. It was a very different approach than we did in 2000. But I think there's a pattern. If presidents are not used to having people get in their face and disagree, and I think it's sort of a shock, you know, when someone does that, as John Kerry did, or as Mitt Romney did to President Obama. It's very different than your normal experience in life. You haven't been out there debating in a primary, and you know, usually, president walks in a room, people applaud, and things go on from there. It's not used to really somebody's out there really trying to score points on you.
And so when you were involved in helping the candidates prepare, was it extensive and exhaustive or casual? And how does that compare to what we hear about Trump?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, every debate prep for every candidate, presidential candidate I work for, or vice president, in case of Dick Cheney, they each had a different style for preparing. But they took it very seriously. I mean, George Bush, we just had a little mini reunion down at the Bush Library in Dallas of those who had helped prepare him for the debate. Myself, Senator Judd Gregg played Al Gore in those debates and was fantastic from New Hampshire. Karen Hughes, Mark McKinnon. But we started very early in like April of 2000, right after he more or less won the nomination. And we kind of kept it quiet because we didn't want people to think, well, here, this guy's preparing for debates in April. But, you know, one thing, he understood there are certain areas that he knew a good bit about that he'd been involved in as governor, like education. But that there was another whole world of issues that he really was not, wasn't that knowledgeable on, and just had never dealt with. And he really worked very hard at it. And we did a lot of debate prep for that, and it was part of that was not just to prepare for debates, but an acquisition of knowledge, and also a way to test arguments. I mean, ultimately, debates are arguments. This is the thing I always hate about people say, well, you know, it's up to this zinger line or this great. They're really arguments. And I think having a debate mindset really helps you in answering other questions and dealing with the press. But he didn't like to have full-on mock debates for like 90 minutes. He preferred to take one subject and let's ask 10 questions on manufacturing or education. So, and really go into it very deeply so that when the debate came around, you would have been asked any possible question. It was just a different approach. He liked that better.
And that contrasted with Cheney?
Yeah. I got involved in Vice President Cheney's when he was picked, which was then July. And it was fascinating because you would have thought that Dick Cheney, someone who, you know, he had been the youngest White House Chief of Staff, I think, congressman, defense secretary. You know, you think it's had this vast body of knowledge. And what he knew extraordinarily well. But he also recognized that there were things that he had not dealt with and didn't know. I mean, education policy in Ohio, things like that. And he worked at it very, very hard. And he liked mock debates, and he liked to have them at the same time of night that the real debate that he would have would occur. But he, we were talking earlier, you know, these presidential campaigns always have these super talented policy staffs for the most part. I mean, I'm not sure what the situation is with Trump, but you know, they usually like Rhodes Scholars, Supreme Court clerks, all these. And I can remember standing in the parking lot of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where we would go out, where the Cheneys had a house to debate prep to get out of Austin because it was 110 in Austin. And one of these policy guys was handing the vice president these two giant briefing books. And he said, which one should I read first? And he said, I'm sorry, sir. He goes, I'll read them both. Which one should I read first? And I thought the guy was going to start crying. He said, you actually will read this? No one reads our stuff. He goes, yeah, I will. And he did. And I think he was really terrific in that debate. And that was always something that struck me about Sarah Palin when they picked her. That was much later because the convention was much later. And say what you will about Sarah Palin, I think it's just unfair to anybody to pluck them and without prepping and throw them into a national campaign. It'd be no different than taking the best politician in America and put them in a last, 7 weeks of a Alaska governor's race. They wouldn't have any idea what they're talking about. And I always thought that was really unfair to her.
Since you mentioned Sarah Palin, how do you compare her performance?
Well, it's very interesting. I encourage you to do this. Go back and look at Sarah Palin's debate performance. I think it was much better than Donald Trump's last night. I mean, she seemed much more in control, much more knowledgeable. It was just a better debate. But, she worked on her debate prep pretty hard.
Curtis and I were talking. Curtis said this was perhaps the most interesting, energized debate he had seen.
I think so, yeah.
So you've seen one now, Stuart. If you had the opportunity to go to Donald Trump and give him a piece of advice about what to do at the next one, what would it be?
That's a scary thought. I'm not a Donald Trump fan. I think with Donald Trump, Americans are always willing to give somebody a second chance, but they have to ask for it and they have to sort of earn it. It's like, it's one thing to say you're going to quit drinking and go to rehab, you ask for a second chance, but it's another thing to just ask for a second chance when you're still at the bar. And I think, Donald Trump, there's this, you hear this a lot, say, well, nothing sticks to Trump, he says these things, it doesn't disqualify. Well, people, he has a 35% favorable. He is the most unpopular politician in national politics in America. So a lot of stuff does stick to him. And I think that he should go out and acknowledge that he's made a lot of mistakes. I mean, there's a way to do that. I've never run for office before. I thought I knew everything about it when I started. Found out I didn't. I've learned a lot, and I made a lot of mistakes, and I said a lot of things that I shouldn't have said probably. I'm used to being in New York, dealing with New York press, where I say anything to get attention. It's good for my real estate business. And I've realized you can't do that when you're running for president. You certainly can't with president. So I'm going to learn. I've learned that, and I would ask those who support me to hope I'll prove that I'm worthy of your support tonight. And if you aren't supporting me, I hope you'll give me another second chance and listen. I think it would have been, well, okay, disarming. But he didn't do that. And I don't think it's really in his nature to do that. There was that moment, when he went out and said there were things that he regretted. But he never really was specific about it, and I don't think it was very convincing.
Stuart, conversely, if you were advising Hillary Clinton, and we talked earlier today. Stuart, I had to thank him. He did a class for me this morning. He did a lunch for us today. He did a class for Charles and me this afternoon, and here he's back doing a program for us. So we really worked him over today. But what would you recommend? You talked about one thing that Hillary might do that would create a meltdown for the guy.
Well, you know, my advice to Hillary Clinton, had I been advising her, there's always this question you sit in these debate preps about likability versus aggression. Her favorables are better than Donald Trump, but by most normal standards, historical standards, they're still low. They probably went up last night, but she's been around 42, 43% favorable. Just by contrast, Mitt Romney and President Obama on election day both had 50% favorables. So, I mean, they were like in a different universe, these two candidates. My advice to her would have been, forget about likability, we'll fix that later, just be aggressive. Go out and attack, attack, attack. If she was comfortable with that, I think that they found a very good middle ground where she was aggressive with him, but didn't seem that the only reason that she was running for president was to beat Donald Trump, which is a danger if you attack too much. So I thought she did a really good job. Some better moments than others, but you know, that's usually the case in a debate. I think the next debate it would be important for her to sustain that same mood. It's very disconcerting to voters when different candidates seem to appear up in different sides of a candidate come out at different debates. This was a problem Al Gore had. He was really hot in the first debate, then he was really laid back in the second. It's people like, oh, I don't know. It's like it's disconcerting because you want to use these debates to get to know people more and get a chance for them to know you. So I think her challenge is going to be to get in that same tone and to continue to speak to why she could be someone who can actually care about regular concerns. I mean, they're both vastly wealthy, and you know, she's been in government a long time. I mean, this is someone who hasn't driven in 25 years. I think to speak to that, which I think she's been doing well. She did well in the debate, in the convention speech, I thought. And
Do you see?
When you spoke about her being aggressive, something occurred to me, because I can think of no more demagogic figure in American politics in my lifetime than Senator Joe McCarthy. He's the closest thing I can think of to Donald Trump. He lied, he fabricated things, he accused people of being communist, he ruined lives, and he was finally destroyed by one confrontation at a congressional hearing with a lawyer from Boston who was defending a young man who McCarthy was smearing, and the lawyer's name was Joseph Welch, finally said to him, and this was televised early on in television's infancy, he said to McCarthy, "Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency?" Don't you think if she really popped him like that,
well, I think her moment
freak out and
I think her moment when she talked about what Donald Trump has said about women was close to that. I thought that was an extraordinarily powerful moment. You know, one of the things I think if you look at her debate versus Donald Trump, for the most part, is talking to the same group of people. That's why he loves his rallies, but they're sort of fun and people come, but he's not getting new votes that way. You know, he's not getting new customers. And I think if you look what Hillary Clinton was doing, there are moments in the debates when she was speaking directly to key constituencies. Particularly, I thought the exchanges on race were very powerful. And I would have been fascinated to see how African Americans in a focus group reacted to that compared to, say, whites in a focus group. I suspect, for most white voters, it was a good moment. But I suspect for African Americans, it was a very powerful moment and really spoke to something that really that's subject in that way had never been addressed in a presidential debate. And I thought that was one of her best moments. And you know, Trump's biggest problem, I mean, just in an electoral sense, is, you know, no Republican has ever, running for president in modern history or close to modern history, ever lost college-educated white voters. I mean, for heaven's sake, Goldwater won college-educated white voters. Trump is losing college-educated white voters, particularly women, and I suspect it got worse last night. You know, there's been one of the great sort of debates within the Republican Party has been, do you need to reach out more, or can you just win by motivating your base, which, you know, means white voters, for more of them to turn out? And, you know, what I just go back to is, you know, 1980, Ronald Reagan won, sweeping landslide, 44 states, beat incumbent president, and he got 56% of the white vote. 2012, Mitt Romney got 59% of the white vote and lost. And a higher percentage of whites turned out in 2012 than they did in 1980. It's just the country has changed. And you just simply can't win without getting a larger share of non-white voters. And after Romney lost, the party led by Reince Priebus, you know, went through this so-called autopsy where he analyzed it. And I think, you know, Chairman Priebus deserves a lot of credit for that. It's always hard to be self-critical, particularly if you were leading an organization at the time. But now with Donald Trump, we've done pretty much 180 degrees from what it was recommended. And I think you can debate, I suppose, whether or not there's a moral imperative that a party to be a national governing party needs to reach a broader segment of the country. I think, yes, of course you do. But you can't really debate the political imperative of it. This electorate will probably be 2% less white than 2012. These white high school or less males every 4 years are just under 4% less of the electorate. So, you know, even if you got the same number of, in what we call the hard count, the real votes that Mitt Romney got, say, of Hispanics, you wouldn't get 27% now in all likelihood. You'd get closer to 24 or 25% because it's a growing segment. If you just stay the same, it's just market economics. And I feel like, you know, a lot of these conversations have in the Republican Party, it's like you're in a car, you need to drive 100 miles, you've got 40 miles of gas, and you're debating whether or not to stop for gas. It's like, that's fine, but like the car doesn't care. The car is going to run out of gas. And, you know, it's the same way you can debate whether or not you need to get non-white voters or this or that. It doesn't matter, you're not going to win if you don't. In theory, there are a lot of people in America who don't vote, including a lot of white voters. But it's very hard to get the kind of numbers you would need to win an election. And I think that's what Donald Trump is going to run up to. Curiously, what's happening, interestingly, I mean, Donald Trump has appealed, by attempting to appeal so much to white voters, he's losing white voters. I mean, if you look at the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, which I think is the best public poll, he was getting 49% of white voters. Romney got 59%. What he's doing is he's turning off a lot of suburban voters and moderate, sort of moderate voters, particularly women. If you just take a map of where Rubio did well in the primary and watch the returns on election night, I think you're going to see those areas of real weakness for Donald Trump. Northern Virginia, suburbs of Atlanta, Charleston, those places, I think are going to be a real problem for him.
You told our class that Trump had no campaign. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, he has no campaign. It's like a concert tour. Kind of goes around, does these events. It's not unusual to get through a primary with a very small campaign. It's probably a good idea to try to get through a primary with a small campaign because you don't have that much money. But you then have to build this real organization. And it's a very difficult thing to do. It's basically, a presidential campaign is basically, till Trump came along, $1 billion startup that exists and dies within 18 months. So the way Republican Party, Democrat Party does the same actually. Under the current law, the practice is that once you secure the nomination, or kind of de facto, you go out and raise a lot of money, and there are different laws. You can only raise for your own campaign in $2,700 increments, but you can raise bigger hunks of money that go to the party. And the idea is you raise a lot of money. It then is distributed to key states for what we call victory committees, somewhat aspirationally. And you work with the state party, and if there's a Senate race, the presidential race and the Senate race work together. So you have efficiencies of scales. You have one phone bank operation. You have one database. You have one, if you're out going door to door for a Senate candidate, and somebody's going out door to door for a Republican presidential candidate, they share that information. Romney started raising $100 million a month in April, and about half of that went to these victory committees. Trump's done really basically none of that. And he just has this small staff. I think it's a huge factor in this race that you don't really see now. But the Clinton campaign is a superb operation. And I know a lot of these people. I have a lot of respect for them. And they have put together a very serious campaign. In many ways, Hillary Clinton's not a great candidate, and they have built a campaign that sort of recognizes that. They don't put her in, it's like a football team. They have a quarterback, they don't put that person in positions where they can't do something well. So they don't try to overextend her. They're not trying to build these huge rallies. They're not trying to do these things. They have smaller events. But every day, there's thousands of people in that campaign that show up and they go to work and they work really hard and they're building a campaign. Until you turn that switch, you don't really see that. But they're very good at it. I'll give you one example. In New Hampshire in 2012, it was pretty much neck and neck between Obama and Romney. Romney ended up losing by a margin that surprised a lot of people and was like, what happened here? So we went back and looked at what happened. 10% of the vote for President Obama was same-day registration on Election Day. That's impressive. That's an organizational feat. And it's the kind of thing that makes a real difference.
You've been outspoken, and so has Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney's gotten his share of criticism, as you have, by Republicans for being so outspoken against Trump. One, why didn't Mitt Romney run if he wanted to be so critical? Two, does he feel like there's something he could have done or should have done to perhaps produce a different outcome?
Yeah, You know, I never want to speak for Governor Romney. Just, you know, there's that period in January of 2015 when he was thinking about running again. He's very comfortable with the decision not to run. I mean, ultimately, you know, running for president, if you've done it, you really understand better than anything. It's a deeply personal decision. I mean, if you look at 2012, two of the most talented Republican potential candidates were Haley Barbour from Mississippi and Mitch Daniels from Indiana, former governor of Indiana, now president of Purdue, right? And they both decided not to run. I've always thought that was very interesting. Those are two guys that knew a lot about what running for president's like, because they'd been around a lot of campaigns, they'd worked in the White House. And they made, I think, a very wise and mature decision. It was sort of a life decision. You know, what I said to Mitt in January 2012, I think the politics of this are impossible to calculate. I think you could win, I think you could come in last. You just don't know. It's really a personal decision. And I think what he said, you know, pretty much these days with Mitt Romney, his on the record and his off the record are the same. He just kind of says what he thinks. And what he said at the time was he thought that it didn't feel right to him and Mrs. Romney, and that he wanted to give someone else in the party another chance to come up. And you know, the expectation was there were some talented people in the party and that they would emerge. Instead, Donald Trump emerged. Which I think is a disaster for the Republican Party.
And you told us you didn't think Trump was really that hard to beat.
No, I think.
So why?
I think Trump benefited from the inability to imagine Trump winning. And a lot of people thought, a lot of these campaigns, they just wanted to get one-on-one with Trump. So they went around attacking other candidates, not Trump, so they could get that chance. I think it was a terrible miscalculation. I think that the way you gain dominance in a crowded field is to take on someone, even if Trump wasn't leading, he was a dominant figure just by being Donald Trump. I think had someone taken Donald Trump on in the beginning and prosecuted Donald Trump and stuck with it, that they could very well have risen by showing that they had disqualified Trump. I don't think Trump's a very good debater, but nobody really went at him. And I think these other candidates proved to be not as good as people thought they were. And I think they, like a lot of candidates, they learned a lot by running and losing. They'll be better if they run again. But you know, certainly I think Mitt Romney improved a lot. I mean, he would say he did. But until you run for president, the degree of difficulty that it is involved in it, I think, is greatly underestimated by a lot of people.
Stuart, exactly a year ago, the three of us were sitting here talking about your new book. Parenthetically, I don't want the evening to pass without pointing out Stuart has yet a newer book. He's got a novel out. He really is a Renaissance man. Innocent, Have Nothing to Fear. It's about a protagonist is a presidential campaign manager, and it's set at a mythical Republican convention in New Orleans. It's a lot of fun. But to get back to politics, real politics, you know, all three of us were very skeptical of Donald Trump this time a year ago. Is it possible, here we are basically debunking him tonight after his performance last night, is it possible we're going to be wrong again, this guy wins?
Well, I hope not. I certainly didn't think Trump would win the Republican nomination. I think he could have been very easy to beat. I mean, if you just take the South Carolina primary, for instance, I mean, one of the most religious states in the country, one of the most military states in the country. I mean, Trump has basically called my former boss, President Bush, a war criminal, saying he lied about getting into Iraq, and he has called previously for George Bush's impeachment, which is fine. I mean, but in a Republican primary to take that position, and then he attacked the Pope in the most religious state in the nation. It's like we were writing something for HBO, and he said, like, well, what if the guy attacks the Pope? You go, well, no one's going to attack the Pope. So he was basically running as this combination of Michael Moore and Christopher Hitchens in a Republican primary, and nobody held him accountable for it. And I just find it the most baffling thing. I mean, one way to look at Donald Trump is, Republicans, Democrats do it too, but more recently, Republicans have done it more flamboyantly, have proven that in a multi-candidate field, a plurality of voters will vote for someone who is unelectable. So if you go back to 2012, you had Todd Akin in Missouri, who won and then lost a very winnable Senate seat, won the nomination. And when Harry Reid was running for re-election, the Republicans nominated probably the only person in the state that couldn't beat him. And the same with Richard Lugar, was a safe Republican seat in Indiana, ran against him, primaried him, and he lost, and someone who was unelectable. So in many ways, you could look at Donald Trump and say, well, the guy's just like Todd Akin, or Sharon Angle, or Richard Murdoch. And I think there's some truth to that. It's never happened in a presidential nominating process before, but what is a presidential nominating process but a bunch of state races? That's one way. I think another way is just how World War I started. No one could imagine it starting. And it was sort of a combination of miscalculation and weakness, thinking that you would be advantaged if you didn't attack him. And then you wake up and Donald Trump's the nominee. Could Donald Trump win? Sure, he could. It's very hard, though, for a Republican to win the presidency now. People don't really appreciate that. The last 8 presidential elections, Democrats have won the same 16 states for 242 electoral votes. In the same period, Republicans have won 113 electoral votes every time. So one is basically starting at 242, and one is starting at 113. 242 is better if you're trying to get to 270. Just, you hear this a lot, in chatter about paths. How do you put together this map? And I've sat in these rooms, and sat in these rooms, and sat in these rooms. It's very hard to get a Republican to 270. It's possible, but Republicans have lost 5 of the 6 popular vote in the last 5 elections. 5 out of the 6. We only won in 2004, and in 2004, we won because we won Ohio. It took us 24 hours to find out if we won Ohio. It was so close. So it's very, very difficult. As the parties are currently sort of constructed. Republicans have to do a better job getting non-white votes. So I think of Donald Trump winning, and I think, okay, is it possible if we took like 8 tires and swung them here and stood across the field, could you throw a football through them? Possible. Yeah. Is it likely? No. Not likely. But, strange things have happened in this race. You have this weird thing of what apparently is the Russian hackers going in, which is just extraordinary. But certainly the race advantages Hillary Clinton.
I want to allow our audience to join this conversation. Curtis and I have plenty more questions, but it's always fun to hear what's on your mind. So are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
Stuart, I have a question about polling. Throughout the primary season, you'd be watching NBC News or something,
right.
They would show the polls and who was leading us that. and then primary after primary, they were just way wrong. And finally, Chuck Todd on Meet the Press said, I want to know what's wrong with our polling.
Yeah.
But it's not just them. I mean, and it appears, quite frankly, that they lean in the direction of their own bias. Can you talk to that?
Well, by nature, polling is a very odd thing when you think about it. So you're going to poll, we have 318 million Americans now. So it would be considered professional to go and Gallup or any of these people. They would do like a 1,400 sample to determine any question for the nation, you know, whether or not you, by nature, that's like, you sort of step back. You know, we kind of gotten used to this, reading about polls, but you sort of step back from it and you go like, how do you do that? 1,400 people, 300, kind of, and it's all based on modeling. It's based on looking at past behavior and being able to predict future behavior. And that's when that breaks down, which is what you see with exit polls, you get these weird variances. That's why I think the best thing to do as a consumer is to look at this Real Clear Politics website, it's called, and they just average together polls. So they take, I think, 8 different polls. Some are better, no, you know, and all those polls, they do have different biases. But when you average them together, it's not a bad, it's a better way to look at it. The central question that you face as a pollster is who is going to vote. It sounds silly, but it's just so fundamental. And how do you reach these people becomes another difficult question because increasing number of cell phones, there's all these issues you have to address. Do you call off a voter list or do you call off a registered voter? Do you do random digit dialing? Do you just call people and ask them if they're registered? It's very hard, and to do it right, it's become very expensive because so many people hang up on you. I mean, these polls are like 20, 25 minutes. Who's going to sit there on the phone with them? It's like, give me a break. And whenever I get called for polling, I never do a hell of the time. So if you've done a zillion calls and you don't have the right sample still, because you know, okay, we got to have a certain percentage of white, non-white. We have to have a percentage of women and men. We know what the demographics are for the country, so you want this to reflect that, right? So what pollsters end up doing is, you know, this dirty little secret called weighting it up. So if you don't have enough young voters, some will weight up more young voters and assume that the X number of young voters that you were able to reach would be the same if they were X squared. And that starts getting very tricky. It's just one more thing that isn't a real period of change. The best way to poll are big samples, reduces your error rate. And it's interesting to look at this rate because the last 3 presidential races, the Hispanic vote in California has pretty much mirrored the national vote. Probably because it's such a large sample that it sort of means out. Romney got 27% of the Hispanic vote nationally, got 29% in California. So I look at that with a lot of interest as far as Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is getting 12% in California. And I personally think that's where, I think he's going to be certainly under 20 and maybe under 15.
So does that mean that he will underperform overall what Mitt Romney did in 2012?
Oh, yeah.
He's going to get fewer votes by far?
Oh, fewer total number of votes?
Total votes.
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. The answer is I don't know. You know, Barack Obama got, you can check these numbers, but something like 7 million fewer votes in 2012 than 2008, but still won. Romney got a little more than McCain. political scientists would look at two candidates that have high unfavorables and say that's going to depress turnout. I don't necessarily buy that, you know. There's a question with Hillary Clinton, will she be able to motivate African American voters the way Barack Obama did? I mean, one of the fascinating things about 2012 was, if you look at a state like Ohio, about 75,000 more African Americans voted in Ohio in 2012 than 2008, which surprised everybody. Because just the thinking was, well, look, the first time you can vote for an African American president, you're going to get the biggest numbers. It seems logical. I mean, as it turns out, no, that wasn't true. The idea of re-electing the first African American president was really important. If you look at Hillary Clinton's numbers in the primaries in southern states against Bernie Sanders, she actually got a higher percentage of African American votes than Barack Obama did when he was running in those primaries against Hillary Clinton. So I think that, and they have a big turnout operation. So I don't know. I think you're going to see differences in turnout. I think you're going to see white males, particularly, who are motivated for Donald Trump to vote in states that Donald Trump will not win more than they voted for Romney, McCain, or even Bush. So a state like California, I would not be surprised at all if Donald Trump got more votes in certain areas than Romney got. But he's going to lose California. Same in New York State, other places.
Other questions from the audience? We'll go here and then we'll go up. Yes, sir.
So you kept talking about, you know, the GOP obviously has to attract non-white voters, but across the board, I think overall, Donald Trump is pulling at almost 0% amongst African-American voters.
Yes.
No higher than 3% in any poll I've ever seen.
Yes.
And so we have, you know, certain GOP leaders like Governor Kasich who are
Yes.
attacking Donald Trump consistently, saying he's deplorable, and others kind of falling in line. So where do you really see the party going here? Because it's a huge split.
It's a really great question. And the answer is I have no idea. You know, I don't know if parties are learning organisms. Look, we lost 2012. We went through this process. I didn't agree with everything in this autopsy, but it was a very well-intentioned, serious effort to look at this and made basic recommendations. You have to do better. So what's the party doing? Exact opposite. So with, I think, predictable results. I don't know. But just on this African-American thing, I mean, here's a little data point. We were talking about this earlier. Before 1964, Republican presidential candidates routinely got 30 to 35% of African-American vote. That's not great, but if you're at 35, maybe you can get to 40, maybe see 45. You know, there were 30, 35% of the country considered themselves in presidential years Republicans. Then in 64, it just fell off a cliff. And now we're down to, I saw a poll recently in a big battleground state, I'll leave it unnamed, but Donald Trump got 0 African Americans. And we were saying to the pollster, like, dude, you know, can't you, like, not one? I mean, he's like, you know, I can't find them. If the same thing happens with Hispanic voters and Republicans in 2016 that happened with African Americans in 1964, we won't elect a Republican president probably in the lifetime of anybody in this room. You just can't get there, barring some catastrophe on the opponent. You know, Romney with George Bush, we were able to get 43% and change of Hispanics. And that's dropped down for a lot of reasons we could talk about, but you know, Romney got 27%, which wasn't enough, obviously. But if you start dropping into the teens, I mean, you know, you're getting a declining market share of a growing market. That's like a bad business to be in.
There was a question right there. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned bias before. I'm interested to see how you feel about how you think the media is influencing the election.
Oh, well, you know, I really don't know what the media is now. It's everything. I mean, I'm sorry.
There's one now.
Yeah, it's your phone. It's your. I don't. It's a whole larger question of these massive disruption in trends in journalism, and I think it's definitely true that people consume information and politics less to inform their opinion than to confirm their opinion. And there's actually, you know, a great science, logarithms and everything that increase that propensity even if you don't want it to. So, you know, when you go on, you know how this works. You know, if you go on Google and you search,
Curtis Wilkie.
tax cuts, why we need tax cuts for the rich, you know, so keep doing that. They're going to send you more conservative stuff because they'll think you'll read that. And I think it's a very troubling, dangerous trend. It's offset by the ability that people have that are more empowered to acquire facts that they want to. I mean, we saw a lot of that last night. I mean, factcheck.org website crashed because so many people were going on it. But I think it's hurt. One of the things, if you look at Donald Trump, you know, he keeps going on, not just Fox, but he keeps like going on Hannity and a couple of, I think he's going to win the Hannity vote. You know. But that's only about 3.5 million people. You know, I mean, it's interesting. And Hillary Clinton, you know, has had less contact with the press than any modern candidate for president ever. Which I think is not a good thing. And say what you will about Donald Trump, he's been much more accessible to the press, to his credit. So I don't know. I think politics is increasingly covered like sports. You know, we have 24-hour channels on it now. A lot of the modeling of how you talk about politics is sort of an ESPN model. You get people that used to do, you know, working campaigns, like, you know, ex-jocks, and they're in the booth and they're talking. And you know, the trouble with most of those people is they haven't done campaigns in this century. But I don't know.
Another question over here. Yes, Bill.
Just for fun. What would a Donald Trump presidency look like?
Well, I'm very negative on Donald Trump. Now, having said that, I have a lot of friends, people I respect a lot, who are for Donald Trump. And I think it's important, particularly now, that we allow for differences. I mean, I could be dead wrong, particularly since it's something Donald Trump doesn't like to do. But and I think there's never been a better need for civil engagement. But I think the totalitarian streak that Donald Trump, his sort of way in which he's drawn to strong men, strong figures, power, the way he talks about it, the way he talks about Putin. I mean, Putin's someone who kissed, Putin's thug shot down an airplane in Ukraine that contained Americans. I mean, this is someone who, it's not an exaggeration, murders Americans. And to praise him, he kills journalists, I think is abhorrent. And Trump has praised Saddam Hussein. And I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the American system works. The way he criticizes the press. You know, and has threatened Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, who started Amazon, that he's going to go after Amazon if he's president. You know, I would really encourage you to seek out and find the stuff that Senator Ben Sasse in Nebraska is writing, Republican. And he made the point that was prompted by the fact there was the Ricketts family in Nebraska, very wealthy family, the ones that funded the building of the College World Series Stadium. They helped fund a super PAC that was anti-Trump in the primary. And he went out and made threats against the Ricketts. And Ben Sasse, as their senator, wrote something, can you imagine this person with the power of the NSA, the FBI, IRS? I share that concern. And we've never had someone who's never held office before running for president. I think in theory that's okay. But the fundamental misunderstanding that Donald Trump seems to have of how the American system works is, to me, deeply foreboding. Were he to be president?
Yes, back here. Yes, ma'am.
In the debate last night, Donald Trump seemed to be personally offended by the ads that Hillary had ran about his
Yeah.
anti-Semitism. What strategy do you think she was employing in terms of trying to weigh being aggressive and all of that stuff?
Well, that is, everybody here, the way Donald Trump responded to her ads. The first rule of debate prep is don't talk about TV ads. I mean, why? I mean, it's crazy. I think Donald Trump responds to everything. And that is why I've always thought he was a very easy candidate to beat in a debate. And, the one thing you control in a debate, the only thing you control in a debate, is what you say, which sounds sort of simplistic and axiomatic. But it's an odd concept that a lot of candidates have trouble grasping. You get asked a question. You don't have to answer that question. You can say anything you want. And they can come back and say, well, you didn't answer that question. Okay. But you have that period of time, and what you choose to talk about gives that subject power, because you're at a presidential debate and you're talking about it. So Donald Trump just responds to everything. I mean, he at one point got off the stage. He was sort of defending this country club he built in Florida. It was like the first time anybody had ever talked about building a country club in a presidential debate. I think it's a great advantage to the other person. And I think it shows a fundamental flaw that would, if he were president, would exist. I mean, what's he going to do if, a president of another country, says something incredibly disrespectful to him? Yeah.
We have another question. Yes, ma'am.
Going after an earlier question about racial changes in the Republican coalition, looking at Donald Trump as being the least ostensibly religious candidate that
Yes.
the GOP's had in a long time, and that particularly being his candidacy being that of one following candidacy of a woman candidate. What do you see as the future of religiosity in the Republican coalition and social conservatism?
There is a group of evangelicals who have, in my view, to their credit, resisted Donald Trump. Dr. Russell Moore, who's from Gulfport, Mississippi, is, I forget his exact title, but second or third in the hierarchy of the Southern Baptist Church. And he's been very respectful, but very firm on what he thinks Donald Trump means, and the negativity of Donald Trump and the racial animosity that Donald Trump is fermenting. I think he's been a real hero. I mean, it's really amazing. I find it extraordinary that someone like Donald Trump attacked the Pope, is being defended by a lot of evangelical leaders. I don't. You never know what's in someone's heart. I don't know what's in Donald Trump's heart. I don't know what's in theirs. I respect their choice, but I find it baffling. And I understand the tribal pull of politics better than most people. You know, I've done that. I like to win. But at a certain point, you have to say, well, what really is important here? So I'm mystified by it. I mean, no one has ever attacked religion the way Donald Trump has attacked religion. He attacked not just Mormons. He attacked Dr. Carson for being a Seventh-day Adventist. He attacked Marco Rubio for being a Catholic. He attacked Senator Cruz, questioning whether or not he was an evangelical. And then there's this whole religious banning Muslims, which he's reiterated, this call to ban Muslims. That is, it's difficult to imagine a more fundamentally anti-American concept than that. I mean, a country that was founded on religious freedom. And it's not, if you think about it, it's not really, to ban Muslims is to, the only way you could really do it is to have everyone, to religious tests to enter the country. Because how do you prove you're Mormon? I mean, how do you prove that you're Muslim or not Muslim if you don't prove what you are? An example I always use is, remember the singer Cat Stevens, this British pop singer who became Muslim. So, you know, what if Cat Stevens shows up at Heathrow, if this was in effect, and goes, well, you know, actually, I'm not a Muslim anymore, I'm a Quaker now. Well, what would you do? Would you, like, ask them, like, trivia questions of William Penn? Like, well, I got a piece of paper here, I'm going to ask you some questions. I mean, I talk to Quakers, I still can't figure it out. I mean, it's an insane idea. So, but just follow that through if you had a Muslim ban. So first of all, that's just about a fourth of the world. So this whole idea, if we're at war with Muslims, then you might as well we should all go use our frequent flyer miles now because we're going to lose. I mean, they're a fourth of the world. So we're on the wrong side if we're going to be fighting Muslims. And the second largest Muslim population in the world is in India. So, you know, Donald Trump gets elected president, so he appoints Bobby Jindal to the Supreme Court. So he has a lot of relatives that live in India. They're Hindu, but so they're going to come here, they're going to have to prove they're not Muslims, or would they be allowed to come here because they come from a Muslim-dominated, a country that's not Muslim-dominated, but second largest Muslim population in the world. First is Micronesia. So we're going to ban. It's madness. And this wall with Mexico, there's not many Mexican Muslims. There are a lot of American Muslims. So theoretically, if Mexico did this, they could ban Americans from coming because they don't want dangerous Muslims. You know, we should actually, I suppose, if you look at this logically, we should be trying to import Mexicans because there are fewer Muslims. It's absurd, but it's incredibly dangerous to talk about this stuff. And I think it's really a normalization of hate. And I think it's completely un-American.
So Stuart, we're about out of time. I'm sorry. I'll go ahead. You had your hand up earlier, and we'll take your question. So, yes, sir.
Stuart, my chief concern with candidate Trump is his diplomacy. I think on one hand, it's fair to assume that he must have keen diplomatic skills when you look at the success he's had in business.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, his natural dogmatic personality is not the most diplomatic of the day. What is your commentary on his capability?
You know, I've dealt with Donald Trump a fair amount in 2012. He's a very good salesman. You know, people forget, and Donald Trump was supposed to moderate a debate in the 2012 primary that Newsmax was going to sponsor. And this was going to be 2 days after Christmas. And, you know, Governor Romney was like, you know, we were debating every few minutes then. He said, like, what, are you kidding me? I mean, it's 2 days after Christmas, we're debating every few minutes, and it's Donald Trump. Like, we're not doing this. So it sort of fell to me to kill it. And his big thing was that we'll get great numbers, which it probably would have. But it's like, we don't have a name ID problem. We don't need numbers. And then, he thought he'd speak at the convention. He thought he would campaign. And he said, he was very persuasive why he should, but we just said, no, you're not. I think his inability to let any slight go is just extraordinarily troubling to think about interacting on that level. I think that seems self-evident. One thing about the business he's in real estate, you don't need to build lots and lots of ongoing relationships. You come in, you do a project, you leave. You go to Atlantic City, you make some money, you leave. You don't do it. And it's very striking to me that, Donald Trump has been in business, inherited a business from his father. He has no business associates. He has family, and he has Donald Trump. If you look at it, that's unusual. Donald Trump doesn't have any close friends. I think that's telling. And, it's always been privately held. There's not a lot of people out there that got rich working for Donald Trump. So, it's just so starkly different than Mitt Romney, who, everyone who worked with Mitt Romney at various stages of his life and various endeavors almost universally enjoyed it and liked him. They started this company, Bain Capital, wildly successful. Most of those people are Democrats. They're Massachusetts Democrats, for heaven's sakes. And I had a lot of them say, look, I love Mitt, but I'm not going to vote for you. Mitt would just laugh. Fine. But tremendous wealth was generated that was shared, which is something that, would have probably done a better job getting that out in the campaign. The amount of money that they made a lot of money in Bain Capital. But the amount of money that Bain Capital generated, it was a minuscule amount that those involved in Bain Capital ended up keeping. Harvard Trust Scholarship Funds has had Bain Capital. Princeton, the Episcopal Church of America, one of their largest investments that they funded retirement for retired priests has been Bain Capital, and it's been like a really good investment. Mitt tells a story that the Mormon church wanted to invest, and he was like, no. He didn't want him to because he was so worried he would screw it up. Because, I don't want to deal with that. But it's a great bet for the Episcopalians. And if you go to Boston, you can't find anything that has Mitt Romney's name on it. But there's not a charity in Boston they haven't given to. And it's just such a fundamental difference. The Bushes are the same way. And it's a very different value system.
So I want to get one last question from the audience here.
Yeah, follow up on your experience in New Hampshire and the ground game, you experienced there. Polling doesn't take that into account, the ground game.
It's hard to.
So, is there a rule of thumb, in your opinion, polling needs to be adjusted? Whomever's got the best ground game, is there a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5?
Yeah, it's a really smart question. Have you seen or read the book The Big Short or seen the movie The Big Short? Mm-hmm. There's that moment when they're asking, what happened if house prices went down? They go, well, we don't have a model for that. And then it's but that never happens. But just say they did. And there's a lot of that in polling. An inability to picture things changing. If you look at all of the modeling that political scientists do in presidential campaigns, right? And there's different models that people have, economic models based, 8 keys to the presidency that if these things happen, it usually will signal which way. They all are based upon the assumption that you'll have 2 campaigns of basically equal weight. One campaign might be a little better than others, one might be, no. that's an assumption. And, you know, all projection is about assumption, and all politics is about probability. So with the Trump campaign, that is a big X factor. They don't have this. Now, they have some very intense voters. I think a larger percentage of certain segments of the white electorate will turn out for Donald Trump. But it's very difficult to look at that. So in 2012, on the Real Clear Politics average of polls, the last average, it's still online if you want to go look, had Obama ahead 0.7. So he won by, what, 3.5? So more. It's a very troubling time to be a pollster. And I have a lot of pollster friends that spend a lot of time on this. But it's a really transitional time.
So let's cut to the chase for the last question. We know you're not going to vote for Trump.
Yes.
You're on the record saying that you've never voted for a Democrat. Who are you going to vote for?
I hate this question. I don't know, is the honest answer. I'm sort of torn in a couple different directions. You know, having worked for Governor Weld, the fact that he's on the Libertarian ticket, I think just the world of him. Gary Johnson is, I wish Bill Weld was the head of that ticket, let's put it that way. Though Gary Johnson is a fascinating guy. Anybody who's climbed Everest and the 7 highest summits has tremendous respect for me. There is this other candidate running, Evan McMullin, who I don't know if he's running as an independent, and I would encourage you to go out and follow his stuff and look at him. Very serious person. Served in the CIA for extensive period and did really impressive, serious things in the CIA. And then was head of the Republican policy efforts inside the House of Representatives. Evan is running really as sort of a call because, you know, particularly for center-right, the nominee of the party, someone who wanted to impeach George Bush, who is for a 45% tariff, who has said that we should think about giving nuclear weapons to Japan. So, I mean, these are just sort of so against what Republicans have been for in so many ways that someone like Evan, who has just tremendous experience, but also real character, I find very appealing. And, you know, we talked about this earlier today. I think voting is the ultimate affirmation in our system. You know, you don't have to vote. Some countries you do. Australia, it's required by law. And not voting is a choice. But I think that when you vote for someone for president, you're saying you think that person is qualified to be president and should be president, or you wouldn't vote for him. So I think that's a very serious personal decision. And there are a lot of Republicans like myself who are just deeply saddened, that's really the best word for it, that we've come, it's so different than what we wanted to do in the Bush years, where we wanted to expand the party. I mean, the way he talks about education, the way he talked about compassionate conservatism. And I think you can think George Bush is a terrible president, think he's a great president, mediocre president, but he was a good person. And I think you had that wonderful moment with the Bushes and the Obamas at the dedication of the Civil Rights Museum last weekend, which I really thought was sort of America at its best, where these two families of, you know, come together. It's troubling. I don't know.
And on that positive note, I want to thank all of you for coming. And Stuart, we especially want to thank you for being
No,
willing to
it's
come and visit with us.
It's great, great, thank you.